Hello and welcome to the 2012 International Fire Code Update based on the 2012 International Fire Code. My name is Bruce Johnson and I'll be the instructor for this webinar today. I hold the position of Fire Service Activities Director in the Government Relations Department here at the ICC. One of the first things that you'll notice if you look at the 2012 IFC is that it has undergone a major revision and it is now reorganized into 7 different parts. And you'll see that the chapter numbers have changed significantly from the 2012. On page 2 of your student handout, you will see that there is an explanation of, number 1, the different parts and the chapters that correlate to those parts of the new organized IFC. And then there is a chapter reorganization chart, which is very handy. It serves as a crosswalk from the chapter number that was part of the 2009 IFC and what the new corresponding chapter in the 2012 IFC is going to be. And if we look at that in some detail, the specific changes, part 1 is going to be administration and definitions. And this is a major shift in the formatting of the definitions that are found throughout the code. In the past, there were some definitions that were found in Chapter 2, and then in subsection 2 of each of the chapters, additional definitions were found that would pertain to requirements and language utilized in that particular chapter. The reorganization will put all of those definitions into Chapter 2, and in the individual chapters where those terms are utilized, just the term will be listed at the beginning of that chapter. So you'll see that anything that's listed there will have a full definition that's found in Chapter 2. Part 2 of the new IFC is going to cover Chapters 3 and 4, and that is the general safety provisions. There are 2 entirely new sections in Chapter 3. One deals with roof obstruction such as wires and cables, and the other one deals with vegetated or green roofs. And we'll talk more about that when we get to those slides in this webinar. Part 3 covers chapters 5 through 11 and then 12 through 19. It includes building and equipment design features. You'll see that there are going to be several revisions of note in Chapter 5. We're adding a definition and requirements for traffic calming devices, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later on. There's requirements for key boxes for existing elevators, and there is some new requirements for fire command centers in relation to building information cards, or BIM, B-I-M, building information card, and the requirements of information that must be provided on site. In fire protection, there are a number of changes and clarifications in Chapter 9 that we'll talk about. Chapter 10, means of egress, had some significant coordinating changes made and some reorganization of that chapter to add clarity. Chapter 11 is where we're going to find the construction requirements for existing buildings. There are some more vigorous requirements for evaluation and structural safety of fire escapes. And we'll talk more about that and the other requirements and intent of Chapter 11 when we get to that set of slides in the webinar. Then we get to Part 4, Special Occupancies and Operations. Those will start at Chapter 20 and run through Chapter 36. And then you'll see that there are a number of reserved chapters that are left blank at this point. Those were inserted so that if there are the need to insert future chapters based on new technology, building practices, materials, etc., those requirements can be added into the IFC without another renumbering of the chapters. And we'll talk more about the importance of those special occupancy and operations requirements starting at Chapter 20 when we get to those sections. Part 5 is where we'll find the hazardous material requirements. They now run through Chapter 50 through Chapter 67. They were formerly Chapters 27 through 44, with Chapter 27 providing the general hazmat requirements, and then the subsequent chapters with specific requirements based on materials or occupancy. So that is how the IFC for 2012 has been reorganized. That may take a little getting used to, but you have the crosswalk and you have the overview that's part of your student handout. So as we review that, you'll also see that there are some other reserved chapters. The reorganization was designed to accommodate future chapters by providing those unused chapters in several parts. This will allow those subject matter experts and subject matter parts to be conveniently and logically expanded without any renumbering of the IFC chapters. And then, of course, as we finish up with the reorganization, we have Part 6, which is Chapter 80. That's going to be all the reference standards. Those are typically found at the end of all the I-codes, and that is a full list of all of the reference standards that are cited in the IFC and the specific IFC code sections where those standards are referenced. And then we have Part 7, which are appendices A through J. Now, as we move to Chapter 3 and the next part of the IFC, you should be on page 5 of your student handout, and you'll see that there are several code change proposals, changes to particular sections, and then, as I mentioned earlier, there are 2 new code sections that are part of this chapter, one dealing with obstructions on roofs and the other dealing with rooftop gardens and landscape roofs that we'll talk about in just a minute. But it is important to review in your student handout the changes to section 307.1.1, prohibited open burning. There are some definitions that deal with bonfires and recreational fires, and also a discussion about allowing prescribed fires, which are typically a method utilized in wildland-urban interface areas to reduce fuel loads or to achieve certain environmental benefits where the ecology of fire is important to that particular vegetation. So the fire code is addressing that practice, not specifically prohibiting that, and putting some other restrictions on bonfires and recreational fires and giving some authority to the fire code official over the regulation. So it's important to review those sections. Now as we move into Chapter 6, Building Services and Systems, you should be on page 8 of your student handout. And you'll see that there's, number 1, a new section for emergency lighting equipment, section 604.5 and its subsections. And this new section contains requirements for regular testing of the emergency lighting. It's intended to make sure that those systems are inspected properly on a regular interval to ensure that emergency lighting works when necessary to provide a lighted means of egress. We'll talk about the photovoltaic photo systems in a second, power systems, and we will take a quick look at the requirements for the standardization of the fire service elevator keys, a new section 607.5 that's highlighted in your student handout. That is important because as we have different elevator manufacturers, it's important to get a standardized key. Similar to the issue with requiring the key box for the elevator, the fire service needs to have one key that is going to allow for the emergency operation of the elevator. So the code requirement now just ensures that those keys are standardized between different buildings and different manufacturers. Now if we look at the fire protection systems, we're going to be on page 11 in our student handout. And again, you'll see that there are a number of code sections that are new or have clarification. And for this webinar, we're just going to touch on some of the most significant changes, realizing that particularly for this chapter and Chapter 10, there's a lot of detailed changes that we will not have time to go over in this webinar. So you'll have to look at those Chapter 9 and Chapter 10 changes on your own in more detail. One of the significant changes to Chapter 9 is a revision to the sections 903, 2.4, 2.7, 2.9 that deal with Group F1 factory, Group M mercantile, and Group S1 storage occupancies, and establish new sprinkler thresholds for the storage and display of both upholstered furniture or mattresses in those groups. And you can see the corresponding square footage thresholds at which level the automatic sprinkler protection is required. Now as we move to Chapter 10, Means of Egress, you should be on page 13 of your student handout. And you'll see that there are several pages of changes that are detailed in your student handout that occurred in Chapter 10. Some is clarification of the existing language, and there are a number of new sections that have been added. We're going to cover just a few of the very significant changes to Chapter 10, but this is a place where you really want to spend some time on your own reviewing your student handout and looking at what has changed in Chapter 10. As a quick overview, coordinating the changes throughout Chapter 10 was to address stairways. There's a general scoping section in Section 1009.1 that indicates stairway provisions are applicable to all stairways, including those that had been called supplemental stairways in the past. This ties into those definitions that we had talked about earlier in Chapter 2, where there's definitions for interior ramps, exterior ramps. Those types of terminology is now being used in Chapter 10. And again, those specific new definitions: exit access ramp, exit access stairway, interior exit ramp, and interior exit stairway. So those are terms that you're going to see used in Chapter 10, and we need to bring that into our vocabulary as code officials. The other significant change for Chapter 10 is the reduced egress width factors for sprinklered buildings that were in the IBC and IFC for the 2000 to 2006 versions were removed in 2009, the table that allowed a reduced width for sprinklered buildings. They have actually been reintroduced now in the 2012 through an exception, but that exception for the reduced width includes not only the requirement for the building to be sprinklered, but where the building has an emergency voice communication alarm system in accordance with NFPA 72. So that's a little confusing. Those reduced widths are back in the code as a design option, but the requirement for the emergency evacuation system has also been added. Now, as we move into Chapter 50, we're in Part 5. And now we are going to look at the hazardous material chapters that were previously chapters 27 through 44 in the 2009 IFC. And of course, these are going to cover hazardous materials operations. Chapter 50 is going to be the general provisions, and then specific requirements will follow in the subsequent chapters. One of the significant changes that you'll see deals with the maximum allowable quantity tables in both the IFC and the IBC. And we'll see that there are also some emergency venting requirements for above-ground storage tanks containing Class 2 and Class 3A liquids. They are now permitted to vent inside the building under specific requirements in accordance with UL 2085.